Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to CAP for having me for this year's UADC lecture series. Today, I'll be giving a lecture on case evolution for Asian parliamentary, particularly at deputy, but also beyond, because I'll be talking about different synergies between DEP, whip, and reply, and general strategy for whips and replies as well, in bits and pieces at least. So here's a quick outline. First, defining and characterizing case evolution. We'll talk about the role of deputy in Asians as kind of groundwork for the rest of the lecture. Third, we'll talk about prep time because case evolution does start at prep time, and to be able to evolve the case well later on, you need to optimize prep in different ways also. This is where the meat of the lecture starts. Uh, Next, we will have mid-round adjustments, what deputies and whips might have to do to make their speeches as strategic and engaging as possible. A subtopic of that being number 5, when to extend, a very common question I get from deputies. And lastly, how deputies can synergize with whip and reply, which is especially important in higher level rounds. So, quick disclaimer before we get to anything. Number one, case evolution is a team effort. Uh, Firsts and whips are crucial to this, both in prep time, but also with the speeches that they give. Obviously, if the first doesn't give a solid speech, it's very hard to evolve the case meaningfully from there. And of course, whips will have to evolve the case a little bit more. It's not just the first speaker speech, contrary to popular belief, that should receive input from others. The deputy speech and the whip for case evolution should also be open to input and collaborative effort uh, amongst the team. Second, this is based on my deputy philosophy over the course of my long career with many different teams and team styles. But that means it's still not a definitive guide. I'm sure there are some bits and pieces that everyone can take, but obviously modify this strategy and build upon it as you see fit. Um, Most importantly, all team styles are different, and some of these tips you might have to adapt. You might synergize better with passing some of the tips from this lecture on to your first speaker or to your whip. So, this lecture hopefully has some insights for firsts and whips to learn from as well. And yeah, sometimes it's best to even front load some of the um, material you'd put in an otherwise evolved case, assuming that the first speaker can handle it with the basic setup they also do. And lastly, just a semantics thing. When I say op in this lecture, it usually means opponents, not necessarily just the opposition team, depending on the example I'm talking about. Okay, with that, let's get into the lecture, starting with understanding case evolution. So I get asked often what case evolution really is. And I got asked to make this lecture by a few people, usually because case evolution is used as a buzzword. It's given by judges sometimes in feedback and not elaborated on further. Oh, you should evolve the case more, but what does that actually mean? And sometimes in other lectures, case evolution is brought up in brief, but not actually expanded upon. So I hope to explain it in the most simple way possible, because we'll get into more intermediate tips later on anyway. So the most basic idea of case evolution is that so you build a basic house or a case from prime minister. Obviously, assuming that your opponents are competent, they will build their own case, which is equally or even slightly more valid um, than your existing case. Um, also rebutting and putting holes in your existing case or house. And by evolving the case, you don't just repair the house that you already have, which is the original case from PM. You have a stronger case in many ways, many different ways we'll talk about later on. All the while, evolving your case by responding to the opponent's case, because of course rebuttals are part of your case as well. So, that sounds straightforward, right? But people usually don't understand case evolution in rounds where they perceive that it's very one-sided, whether for your team or for the opponent team. For example, some deputies come to me and say, well, in prep time, we front loaded all the best arguments to first speaker. So how do I evolve the case? Or I've responded to the other team in its entirety. Now, what do I do? Right? If their case is as useless as a pile of rubble. So the first response to this is that it's usually not that easy. Um, it's not possible that the prime minister probably ran all of the best arguments or all of the arguments worth running. And second, you probably haven't completely destroyed your opponent's case and reduced it to rubble. So check yourself first to see if there's really no responding to do or if there's no meaningful improvement upon first speaker arguments that you can do. But if you still think, well, yeah, in these regards, I've still done all that I can, there are still many more ways to evolve the case, which I've also given visual metaphors here that I've had way too much fun with. So, one way to evolve the case is to give different structural reasons as to why your PM's existing conclusions are true, right? So, you're replacing your arguments, which are, made from a sturdy, perhaps straw or wood frame. Now you are reinforcing these structural reasons with bricks and also giving a brick wall or preemptive um, responses or other preemptions which protect your case from any responses that opposition might have, right? So just adding additional structural reasons as to why your PM's conclusions are true reinforces the case. Obviously, this is not always important or necessary, but sometimes it is important when anticipating other argument responses your opponents can give. Another way to evolve a case is providing additional framing and weighing as to why your arguments are more important, represented here by having a taller tower than the opponent's case. So this is important in rounds where both teams are good, they're able to prove their arguments are true. It's a matter of weighing who has the stronger argument, in this case, building a taller tower, etc. That's another way to evolve the case. A third way to evolve the case is by co-opting your opponent's benefits. Even if you think your own benefits of your own arguments are already weighing higher in the round, it definitely doesn't hurt to co-opt your opponent's benefits and hedge risk against a scenario in which the judge might believe that the opponent's arguments are more important or at least equally important to yours. So you might want to co-opt their benefits, metaphorically ripping the roof off of their base. And lastly, of course, the most common and straightforward way to evolve a case is just giving a new argument. Of course, you should only give new arguments if they are equally or more important to your existing arguments. Because, of course, debate is not just having more arguments than the other team. It's by having better weighed, better built arguments that are proved to be likely, but assuming that both sides have well weighed and well proven arguments, obviously having more arguments is a helpful way. So this is a lot, right? And of course, you shouldn't try to do all of these in every single round. Of course, in an ideal world, you could, right? You do a combination of all of these case evolution methods and you just obliterate the other team. But, realistically, with limited time in your speeches and power matching with your opponents, you must be very strategic with which form of case evolution you prioritize. And we'll talk about the decision making that gets into that as we go along in this lecture. Second, understanding the role of deputy. So this might seem intuitive. We've heard it in briefings a million times, right? The deputy's job is to rebut the other team's arguments and provide new arguments, or maybe you also have to rebuild your first speaker's arguments. But that doesn't really capture the full scope of what the deputy does. And it's not often helpful to hear that that is the role of deputy because it's very complex, right? Just giving new arguments and rebutting the opposite team. Easier said than done. So I have a few more tips that might help with understanding the role of a deputy. Let's get back to basics again. The role of a deputy is largely shaped by their position in the round. You have to realize that by the end of your deputy speech, whether you're DPM or DLO, more than half of your team's time to speak has passed, right? So the prime minister plus the deputy, that is a combined 14 minutes. After you, you only have a whip and a reply, which is 11 minutes, and also whip and reply are constrained in what they can actually say, right? So that's very important to note. Secondly, in Asian parliamentary, unlike BP, there's no need to burn material or be the last line of response. So there's a lot more flexibility that you have in your speech. And lastly, you have the least time allocated to you preparing for your own speech. Of course, the first speaker speaks first, but prep time should be fully dedicated to first speaker. That's the first thing you need to know as deputy. Don't be selfish. Prioritize helping your first speaker. Give them as much material as possible. So it's not solo, at least, even though your first speaker has to speak first with the least prep time. But second, whip, can listen for the entirety of the speech and gets 28 minutes of, the first exchange, second exchange to prep the whip speech additionally. So as deputy, you only have the first exchange and you don't have as much help as your first speaker in building your own speech. Since we understand the position of the deputy, each of these positioning informs the role of a deputy, right? Which are three as well. You don't have a template as a deputy. So if your first question is, what template should I follow as a deputy? There is none. You simply have to fulfill these three roles, right? Firstly, try to be ahead of the other team in terms of well-built and well-weighed material. Again, it's not a quantity contest, but assuming that both sides have high-quality arguments in a relatively equally matched round, obviously it helps to have more material than the other team. And this responds to the fact that most of your team's time to construct has already passed by your speech, which means if you're not ahead of material than the other team by the end of your speech, then it's going to be much harder for your whip to win the debate. Secondly, you have to ensure that your team has 1 to 2 win conditions and that by the end of your speech, it is clear to the judge that you are fulfilling them, at least partially, right? So by the end of your speech, it should be clear to the judge what your team's winning frame is, right? Whether it's a retained frame from your first speaker or a new frame that comes out at deputy, it should be very clear by which metric or by which clash, right? Which frame as a whole your team is winning the debate in. Secondly, of course, it's not enough to just identify what the winning frame is, who the most important stakeholder is, what the most important clash is. You need to be winning that clash, right? You need to prove how you're winning on that frame and on that clash. And lastly, you have to weigh this frame against your opponents, because obviously, assuming your opponent has their own frame, they have their own weighing and reasons why they fulfill their frame. You need to weigh your material and really prove why your frame is more important than the others. Okay. So you're free, unlike a prime minister who has a template, you are more flexible on how you allocate time to do all three of these steps. But as long as it's very clear to the judge what the main reasons are for your team to win the debate, aka win conditions, once they're clear by the end of your speech, you're well positioned to try to win the debate. And lastly, since you have the least time dedicated to yourself, to your own speech, and you have the least help preparing your own speech, you have to be a dynamic speaker, right? You're well suited to the deputy role if you're good at tracking your opponents very quickly and adjusting your speech content only if necessary. That is, okay, right? Obviously, if what you've preempted and prepared during prep time for your own speech is more important or impactful in the debate, opponent hasn't really given very important things that you need to address, perhaps you don't have to adjust your speech, but in most cases, you have to be dynamic and adjust your speech based on what the opponent says. So this is a skill to train. It helps if from the beginning you are well suited to this role to begin with. Okay, with that, we can now get on to the meat of the lecture, what you should do at prep time to ensure that you can evolve the case well later on. Firstly, thinking ahead during prep. During the veto, um, the whip and deputy, as much as possible as late speakers in the round, should be thinking about the trade-offs and the worst case of your side in the motion. I'm not saying this is the primary consideration of when you should veto a motion. Obviously, your first speaker and the considerations of do we know what we would run in this motion? That is a very important question to ask. But if you're thinking ahead from a case evolution standpoint, that dictates that you should also know, never mind that we can run, what about the opponent team, the opposing team? What can op run? And is that sufficiently threatening? Or can we defend or respond to what op runs, um, and take a trade off, assuming that op runs the best case possible? Are we able to trade off what they force us to trade off and weigh our exclusive benefits as more important, right? So it's a mix of both, right? In the veto, you should ask yourself both: do we know what we can run, and do we know what the opponent can run, and can we, can I as a deputy immediately kind of visualize at least the basic direction of analysis I will use to defend the trade-off or the worst case, and respond to the strongest arguments of all. Oftentimes, debates sometimes can be decided by vetoes. So make sure that you are thinking, of more than just what we might run when vetoing a motion, or do we have matter on this? That's not the primary consideration that should go into a veto, because it matters to case evolution. Secondly, as a deputy or a whip, of course, you should still prioritize helping with your first speaker's entire speech, right? Because to be able to evolve the case to begin with, you need to have a solid foundation of the case. And it also helps to have a material advantage, right, in the first exchange. Why? Because if you don't help your prime minister and you're spending so much time on your own arguments as a deputy, well, you can't even run your extension because you have so much to respond to the other team, whether it's their first speaker or their first and second speaker, right? You need to be at a material advantage to have enough breathing room to evolve the case to begin with. So remember, always prioritize helping your first speaker. An additional suggestion I have here is assigning roles based on what I have seen to be most conducive to prep time, right? Since, obviously prep is collaborative. Everyone can contribute to the setup. Everyone can contribute to the arguments themselves. But just think about it as, since the first speaker is the one delivering the speech and needs to know not just the broad strokes of a speech, but the nitty gritty of the speech itself, it is more conducive for the first speaker to be assigned roles that to think of things during prep that are directly connected to the nitty gritty of their own speech. Okay, so it might help to assign the first speaker the role of one, thinking of what is needed to refine the setup, building the policy, 3 or 4 prongs to the policy to make it airtight. Second, ensuring that all parts of their template are complete. The first speaker should, have a clear template already, identify, if we're missing any context, if we're missing any impacting, if we're missing any, middle analysis for an argument. Next, deputies and whips. It's a lot more flexible here since they're late speakers anyway. But generally, deputies and whips, once they're finished helping the first speaker and during quiet time where the first speaker is fixing their first speech already, perhaps the deputy and whip are the ones in charge best of preempting opposition frames, arguments, and crucial actors or stakeholders that would need to be catered to the most. So I say that this can be done at quiet time after building the first speaker speech, but it might help, if you have a preemption straight out of the gate, you should say these preemptions to your first speakers as you think of them. Of course, only if it's very relevant, because it might help them build their first speaker speech better, right? As soon as you understand what the ops frame and arguments might be. Secondly, deputies and whips, when thinking about what they might have to run in their own speeches, it doesn't necessarily help to create arguments or extension arguments always first that you will run in your speech. Instead, first, try to identify late game trade-offs, frames, and weighing that might be necessary to make at deputy and whip, right? Because now that you've preempted what opposition might say and frame and impact, right? You're the one who has to respond to that, right? So how are you going to take that trade-off? What framing is necessary to frame out material that opposition might say or prove why it's not the most urgent or not the highest impact in the round? I think this is a lot more strategic than just going straight to extensions. Because if you're thinking of extensions anyway, you probably could afford to give that to your first speaker, or that extension might not be as impactful as this trade-off framing and weighing that you might have to do to the other team. Engagement might be more important than additional constructives. But lastly, of course, deputies and whips during prep time should also strategize on potential extensions. Um, Sometimes, and I think you should base this on the motion, right? Because some motions are more conducive to having many different arguments and therefore many extensions. Some motions are conducive to just having a few arguments. But yeah, in those motions where it's very wide and there are many different arguments that can reasonably weighed as very important in the round, then in those cases, it's good as a deputy and whip to strategize on potential extensions and how to frame them as debate winning. Now, really quickly, how do you decide if you should give an extension to your prime minister or your first speaker or save it for your deputy speech? Firstly, obviously, do they think that they have enough time to run it? That's just simple. It's better to run 1 to 2 good arguments complete rather than run 3 arguments which are a bit half baked anyway. So, do they have enough time? But secondly, some extensions are simply better placed in deputy regardless of how easy it is to build in prime minister, right? So sometimes, it helps to hear out the opposition team first before you introduce an extension. For example, if your case is about accountability or helping minorities, then it might not help to have a sudden extension about the economy at first speaker. But if opposition team, the intuitive arguments for opposition are about the economy, right? Then it's helpful for deputy to prepare an extension in which government can also have you know economic arguments, arguments that benefit the economy as well. So yeah, think about that in terms of splitting material between first speaker and second speaker. All right. A quick note on preemptions. So when you're doing preempting, make sure that it's you're spending time on preempting the strongest possible material that the opposing team can run. Right? You have limited time in prep, and time is usually better spent improving the first speaker unless it's preempting the strongest material that the opposing team can run. I'm not just saying to preempt the strongest one argument that the opposition can run, but whatever the strongest, material that could beat your team, you should preempt that stuff. And the reason why is one, it's time inefficient to prepare responses for weak op material. I mean, opposition can run an infinite number of things anyway. And the weaker the material is, right, the easier it is to respond. So don't waste so much time preempting everything opposition can say. If it's weak, you can respond to it on the spot. Or if they respond to something that isn't weak, right, like it's pretty well built, but it's not the strongest, most impactful thing the opposite team can run, you can outweigh that material anyway with the preemptions that you prepare. So, yeah, preemptions have multiple applications. As I said earlier, if you think of an urgent preemption as a deputy, you should use that to help inform the first speaker's speech, because in the framing, from the very beginning of the framing of the first speaker, perhaps you can downplay potential op arguments. For example, again, it's debate about should we help minorities or should we help the economy first. Perhaps the framing could talk about how important economies are. How important minorities are, and therefore why in framing in itself that minorities are very important, you can insert in that some downplaying of why the economy can wait or how the economy can recover in the long term. We need to help minorities now, right? So these kinds of preemptions, knowing that opposition would run an argument about the economy, is very helpful in informing the framing of the first speaker. You can also reinforce the policy or model, especially if it's a policy debate. Perhaps you can add prongs to the model that immediately kind of make opposition arguments or opposition criticisms of your policy a bit more unlikely. Assuming you have the fiat for it, why not improve your model in that sense? And even if it's not a policy debate, right? If it's just a model or your world building, you might want to world build part of the debate that explains why opposition arguments might be less important or might not be likely to accrue to begin with. Okay. Now, preemptions as to their applications for the deputy and whip speeches. Obviously, if you preempt opposition material, you should prepare responses for it. And as I said earlier, extensions that might help co-opt these benefits that op might run, or pieces of weighing that might deal with the strongest potential opposition material. So following along with my example, responses, why does opposition not get economic benefits? Secondly, how do we also co-opt a lot of economic benefits on government? But lastly, in the worst case, if we get less economic development than op, here is why that economic development does not matter, right? Preemptions can, already provide those three layers of response to opposition. Now, in the worst case, if op does not use the strong material that you preempted, remember that you can recycle this weighing into an impact or constructive, right? Even if they don't run the very strong argument you thought they would, right? You can still respond to this in an even if to extend the margin of debates. Or, since weighing is comparing your existing comparative with their strongest comparative anyway, right? Your strongest argument versus their strongest argument. If they don't run their strongest argument, you can still use that weighing as impacting for your own strongest argument. So it's still very utile in the debate, and that's why I think preempting is worth dedicating time to. Now, a couple of disclaimers though about preempting. Firstly, preemption takes a lot of experience. At first, what you preempt that opposition might say might not be what they actually say. And so in those cases, you shouldn't be too attached to the responses or especially the new extensions that you make preempting something opposition says. This is one of the most common mistakes that I see, right? Teams who are dynamic and don't do enough preemption try to incorporate preemption, and suddenly they're no longer dynamic, right? Deputies prepare so much material that they become attached and invested to during prep time, so that even though by their speech it's not actually relevant anymore, they still run it anyway because it's there in their notes. Try to avoid that, okay? You should definitely be trying to be dynamic and be honest. If your preemption doesn't pan out, you don't have to run that material. Of course, as I said, even if your opponent uh, doesn't run what you preempted, you can sometimes still use that material and recycle it as weighing, but don't force it, okay? Only if it is really relevant or it is still helpful to the existing debate. Lastly, regardless of what you preempt, op may run, don't lower your constructive arguments to their impacts, right? When you create your arguments, especially first speaker arguments, try to run arguments with the highest impact possible, which are still realistic, of course. But yes, try to make sure that your impacts are not bogged down to what you preempt op might run. And so you kind of play it safe and try to just have impacts that are marginally higher than theirs. No, still try to run as high impacts as possible as long as you can reasonably prove them. Okay, next, how do you do mid-round adjustments as a deputy and also, partially as a whip, right? This is what speakers struggle with, as it is the most intimidating, especially when your opposing team is backloading a lot of material, right? It's very difficult. So, the common question that I get, especially in losing debates, when speakers are losing, they don't know what they should do first. Should they rebuild their teammates first? Should they whip at deputy? Whipping at deputy is essentially just, tallying and organizing existing material in the debate thus far into clashes in the same way a whip would do, and kind of prove why you win those clashes, add responses, and add weighing. Should you prioritize whipping at deputy, or should you prioritize extending with actual material? So no matter how difficult a debate might seem, of course, there are different mid-round adjustments that you can do. You can boil it down to a science almost, by remembering your role, okay? What you should prioritize among these three in your speech depends on what gets you to these end goals, right? How do you get those one or two win conditions that you are clearly fulfilling? And what should you do to be most dynamic and responsive to the strengths of your opponent? Okay, so let's tackle the first thing: mid-round adjustments for ensuring that your team still has one to two viable win conditions to win the debate. Okay, so first we have to understand what a viable win condition actually is, right? There are three broad types that I've identified, and I think generally have succeeded in most rounds, and most judges will recognize them as reasonably debate winning um, impacts if you win the clashes that revolve around them. So, number one, a pragmatic impact that can be weighed intuitively as most important in the round, right? An uncontestable impact that obviously all stakeholders should care about and the average reasonable person should care about, right? How do we help those stakeholders and what do those stakeholders need, right? It's easy to win the debate if you help out the most vulnerable person and give them the biggest impact, right? Secondly, though, there are types of impacts that can win the debates, even if they're not the biggest, most impactful impacts. And that happens when they are very certain impacts that you can prove are mutually exclusive to your side, right? Of course, a higher impact argument will beat out arguments that are certain but low impact. Okay, so if you want to make a win condition out of impacts that are certain but not the biggest, then you have to deadlock other clashes, or you need to prove that other impacts in other clashes are speculative. You know, like the big arguments, like the economy, etc. Maybe that's too speculative. You know, the biggest arguments of holding those in power accountable, maybe that's speculative. Neither side can get it, and so it's not mutually exclusive. That is the case where smaller impacts, such as helping more minority stakeholders, etc., might be easier to prove if it is certain this is a winning impact. And now, lastly, we get on to principled impacts, in which if you prove it's mutually exclusive and you prove why the principle is important, that itself can be a win condition in as well. Of course, proving how to make principles into a compelling win condition, that's a lecture on its own. It's very hard to prove, especially in certain debates, why a principle matters more than pragmatic conclusions. Sometimes principles are attached to pragmatic outcomes after all. But yeah, generally, just know that if you can use generally accepted truths to society, to average reasonable persons, um, right? Value a principle as very important. Therefore, it is universally valued. Then perhaps a principle could matter even more than a pragmatic outcome, right? So, for example, when you're talking about uh, you know, basic human rights, such as why you shouldn't enslave people, you should protect people's agency. Maybe that doesn't maximize utility, right? Because utility might be better if you just enslave people, etc. But of course, you would never do that because slavery is a absolutely awful, unacceptable, principled evil that is universally accepted as a moral truth, right? So that's just an example of how principles can become win conditions, but you need to have the explanation as to why they're so important. Okay, so these are the types of win conditions. So as a deputy, in your speech, you should flag these win conditions and kind of clarify that burden and tell to the judge, the team that wins this debate is the team that does X, Y, Z, and then you prove how you fulfill those win conditions. Now, it's strategic to mix and match win conditions and to have some of them prepared from prep. So, for example, in prep time, if you have two high impact arguments over the course of the debate, right? As a deputy, you can evaluate, okay, in the opening exchange, in the first exchange, maybe this argument, opposition is contesting very heavily, but the second argument is still untouched and yet it's still high impact. Maybe in your deputy speech, you might kind of deadlock or go away from the more heavily contested argument and you would pivot more to explaining to the judge how your team has this second argument, opposition hasn't responded too much, and this is debate winning on itself, on its own, and then add additional layers of weighing as to why it's important. Add different layers of analysis as to just to make sure that it's true, etc. In terms of, so if you can create two super high impact arguments, either one of the two could reasonably be weighed as debate winning, do that and pivot to the one that's easier to prove. But sometimes that's very hard. Sometimes it's hard to have two very high impact arguments. So maybe here you have one high impact argument and one certain, very easy to prove mutually exclusive argument or a principle, since low impact but certain arguments and principles generally are interchangeable in their purpose, right? It's guaranteed to your side. So here, if this is your strategy, having one high impact argument, one certain argument, try to win the debate on the high impact argument. If it's becoming a deadlock or it's becoming a wash, then you can pivot more and say, hey, judge, as deputy, you can say, hey, judge, even if, being charitable to opposition, this whole debate is a wash and we don't get our first impact. Here's why this second impact is mutually exclusive to our side. Here's why it's debate winning. Another strategy you could do. Now, as a deputy, mid-round adjustment, you should not always have to just create something completely new from your deputy speech, right? Because if you've spent 30 minutes on your first speaker speech, then they should already have a viable argument which sets up a win condition for your team already. Okay, so don't be the type of deputy that goes completely rogue and deviates from the material you had in prep. In prep, your first speaker has already supposedly gotten the most impactful argument. So avoid completely abandoning your first speaker. Okay. In most cases, after all, if your argument is the most intuitive, simple, best argument for your side to prove, then this argument should still be salvageable, and therefore, the impact of that argument can still become your win condition, right? So yeah, can this win condition be salvaged? In most cases, it should be. So you should try to salvage it. So when trying to salvage it, the question is, how much time would it take to win that clash, right? How much time would it take to actually win the opening exchange if we are currently at a losing point, right? And that's how you should decide, whether it is worth spending enough time on it to win that clash, or if you should just try to wash it or deadlock it instead. So yeah, these are the questions and you should ask as a deputy when doing mid-round adjustments. How can I, or what do I need to say to achieve the win conditions that my prime minister has said? Or what new win condition can I reasonably introduce and win on in my speech? Okay, a bit nerdy, sorry, but I also have here a flowchart for the next stage, right? The second part, which is being dynamic and adapting your speech to your opponent. So here's a flowchart, right? I said to be dynamic, and yet we're using a flowchart. Well, at least it eases the thought process, since you have to be dynamic in the material that you run anyway. So the first question you need to ask to adapt to the debate that's happening is my first speaker winning the opening exchange? Okay, right after PM and LO, which side is winning? You have to be honest with yourself here. No confirmation bias, and it should not offend your first speaker. Of course, don't rub it in their face if you think that they lost the opening exchange. But either way, it's not their fault anyway, right? It's a team effort to create the first speaker speech. And so if you're all losing the opening exchange, that's fine. Let's just admit it and move forward as best as possible. So, of course, that doesn't mean always be pessimistic and always think you lost the opening exchange, because the way that you create your deputy speech should be based on an accurate depiction of whether or not you're winning the opening exchange. So if you are winning the opening exchange, clearly, right, both in terms of material, in terms of, all metrics, you have more material, it's better impacted, and that's very clear to the judge, then you have the simplest job as a deputy. First, just do some additional weighing. Of course, bring back the material your first speaker is winning on and make sure it stays relevant in the round. Then try to extrapolate new impacts and new conclusions from your prime minister's analysis, right? That's the most fun that you can have anyway, right? The hard part is building and proving the argument. So as a deputy, if your first speaker is winning the opening exchange, feel free to extrapolate even more impacts and conclusions to extend the impacts and margin for your team even further. Then you have to ask yourself, what are the remaining threats to us winning the round? Okay. Um, it could be one or two of these things, or it could be both, right? If there's a threat that opposition might backload a new extension completely, based on a POI perhaps, or maybe based on what you've preempted during prep time, then that's what you should use your preemptive responses and weighing. It doesn't hurt to front load it at deputy, especially if you're preempting the strongest thing op can run, because that response and weighing will work as a contingency against even a wide array of things that opposition could say. And secondly, if a threat is that op might backload proper mech and weighing, right? So this happens at certain times, despite the meta shifting to front loading. There are still teams that backload heavily, and perhaps the argument is, it's a promising argument at first speaker, but they don't run it properly, they don't impact it properly. You are still in danger of the second speaker backloading this mech and the weighing, or even the whip backloading this weighing, since the basics were there in earlier speakers already. Yeah, since this could happen, might as well at deputy assume the best case of opposition on this argument and mitigate and outweigh it, right? Assuming that you should be able to get the gist of what the opposition team is saying. If what the LO says is reasonable and they don't build it properly, point that out, right? Obviously, point that out and prove and point out that it should not be credited as heavily. But you should still take it as best case. If you understand what they're trying to say, respond to what they're saying in their best case, because that makes sure that your team is safe from any potential backload. Okay, so that's all you have to do in most cases, in my opinion, at least. If your first speaker is already winning the opening exchange, just ensure that you stay ahead and that material stays relevant. However, what if you're winning the opening exchange, but not optically? And when I say optically, I mean in terms of vibes, right? It might seem like you're not winning the debate, even though you are, for judges that are properly tracking and scrutinizing material. Okay, so in that case, there's two reasons why this might be true. Number one, the opposite team might have lots of structural reasons, but these structural reasons are not, are weak, right? So they say it. We have 5 structural reasons, but actually 2 of them are the same thing, and the last 2 structural reasons aren't even strong anyway, right? Another time that you might be winning, but not optically, is when the other team overclaims, like they have really big impacts that sound really good, and obviously the judge might just vote for them because their impacts sound big and are bigger. But if they are overclaiming, then you need to take some steps to make sure that the judge doesn't immediately credit the other team, and they don't buy into the optics or the vibes that the other team is using to win the debate. Okay, so if the other team has a lot of structural reasons that are weak or big impacts, but they're overclaiming, what you should do as a deputy is to first flag what they're doing and respond to it accordingly. So flag, the other team's structural reasons are very weak. 2 of them are very repetitive. I'll respond to the last 3 because they're very weak. Or if they're overclaiming, it helps to have an introduction, which is that, just explaining why opposition cannot at all realistically claim their impacts, and rebuild your first speaker speech as to why their impacts, your own team's impacts, which might be smaller but are guaranteed and realistic, should be credited and win the debate. So once you've done that, it's the same as a speech which you are already winning very clearly. If you are winning but not optically, just do a bit of cleanup, deal with the assertions the other team has, and then proceed to the steps I talked about earlier, right? Additional weighing, new conclusions, and preemptive responses and weighing, mitigating their best case. Okay, this is the hardest one. Um, if your first speaker is not winning the opening exchange and now you are down on material, how do you try to bring back the debate? Question you have to ask is it time efficient to correct your first speaker's material, right? If it is time efficient to correct it, right? And what is the standard to that? It varies per debate. But basically, does it take more time to build a new frame and a new extension that we can make as debate winning? Or does it take more time to just repair and try to rebuild the first speaker speech? Obviously, most time it'll be more efficient to repair than construct an entirely new thing. So in cases where it is more time efficient to, uh, correct and try to win back the opening exchange, the first thing you should do is obviously mitigate the responses opposition gave to your first speaker, prove why they're weak, prove why there's another incentive structure or consideration, which means that opposition's responses are not the most important ones. Say whatever you need to arrive at the end conclusion, which is that my arguments for my first speaker still stand. Those are still true. So once you've done that, again, go back to just do additional weighing. You've already proven why your first speaker speech, is still true. Do that weighing, do those new conclusions, etc. However, if it takes way too much time to kind of win this back, perhaps both PM and Deputy Prime Minister have preemptively and responsively destroyed the leader of opposition. Remember that, or maybe they haven't destroyed leader of op in all clashes, but at least one clash. Remember that if you're losing a clash, do not just abandon that clash completely and just stop speaking about it. Try to mitigate the responses and deadlock that clash at worst. Perhaps you don't get the benefits in that clash, but make the edge doubt if opposition team gets the benefits in that clash on the comparative, right? Do whatever you can for damage control, but don't spend too much time on that. Ultimately, if you have to, launch a new frame, explain why that new frame is reasonably debate winning, and then launch a new extension to win the debate on that metric. Okay. Obviously, you can still have new extensions even if you are winning the first exchange, if you have time. But I'm saying you should only really resort or commit to an entirely new frame or new extension if you cannot build off of your first speaker. Okay. And that ties into the next section, which is when to extend, right? Because, as I've said, I've gotten a lot of questions. When should I extend? When should I just rebuild or just keep weighing? Realize that it's very hard to sell the judge a new extension at deputy. Okay? Of course, you are still a constructive speaker, but you have much more limited time to establish a new premise, a new middle analysis to prove your conclusion connects to that premise, and then you have to do impacting and weighing against opposition material, right? Which has had double the time that you have, assuming that their first and second speakers are synergized and coordinated versus you who is disconnected from your first speaker with your new extension. Okay? So that's why it's very hard to sell a new extension. But more importantly, there's many ways that you can maximize and improve existing material to win the debate rather than just extending, right? Because existing material at most times is already proven, right? Your first speaker, at the very least, hopefully, prove that the argument is true. Maybe they haven't proved why it's so important or the different stakeholders that can benefit, all of the different impacts you can get from that. But they've still proven that it's true, and that is already a lot of time saved that allows you to do the impacting. Okay? But secondly, it's usually harder to prove an argument than it is to weigh it, right? So that's why, right? If your first speaker has already proven it, why prove a new argument from scratch? Because it's easier to weigh than it is to prove, in my opinion. And here's why, right? If you're creating a new premise at deputy, especially deputy leader of opposition, The other team already has 3 to 5 uh, structural reasons for a conflicting claim, right? If they're running their case properly, right? So you don't only have to prove something is true from the base up, you have to respond to the counterclaims that opposition has already lined up for this new claim. Even if it's not, directly a preemption for your new claim, right? Lots of their own analysis already preempts and kind of takes out the possibility for your new claim to be true. But secondly, and this is what I think teams need to realize, weighing is a lot more subjective compared to just proving an argument is true. You cannot just invent an argument out of thin air if it's not true in real life and it doesn't make logical sense, right? Comparatively, weighing, of course, weighing has to make sense, but it is more subjective in a sense that the way that people perceive values and the way that an average person may perceive the value of things is different. It's flexible. And that is why, of course, you shouldn't just invent weighing, which is super unintuitive out of thin air. But you can use your creativity to weigh almost anything, any value as more important than any other value. You can weigh why accountability is more important than economic fulfillment, right? And vice versa, right? You can prove why self-actualization and following your passion is more important than general wealth and greater security. There's more flexibility there because, uh, and that's why I think you should try to capitalize on what your teammate has already proven and just add the additional weighing to make it even more relevant in the round. Last reason, last way that existing material can be maximized. If opposition is overclaiming, um, these big impacts that we talked about a while ago, right? They're trying to claim big unrealistic impacts. Usually you can use the context and framing of your first speaker to ground the debate back in reality. So for example, if it's about a developing post-conflict state where humanitarian aid is not being let in, and we should negotiate with the government rather than crack down on them. And the other team is saying, no, we should get, freedom of speech, all of the, first world benefits for the people on the ground. Obviously, if your first speaker has set up all this context about how um, it's so hard and nearly impossible to get, advanced first world benefits for people in a post-conflict state with an oppressive government, then it's not strategic to create a new extension that tries to co-opt these benefits and liberalizes the country. It's more strategic to say, did you listen to my first speaker? They already proved why these big impacts are impossible. That's why our team is claiming more realistic and assured arguments instead. All right. That said, obviously, I don't want to be so biased against new extensions. Definitely, I still use them. Next, new extensions do have a place. Just make sure that you've already rebuilt and maximized your first speaker speech before you launch an entirely new extension. Okay. And there's 2 times where a new extension is best to be used. First, when it's for co-opting benefits from upside that are entirely distinct from yours. Okay. Sometimes, you've created your first speaker has high impact arguments, but opposition has different high impact arguments that you haven't preempted either. You might need an extension to try to co-opt those benefits because it's completely divorced. These equally big benefits are completely divorced from your first speaker's case. Now, if, it might be unintuitive, but there are ways to co-opt a lot of benefits from the op team. One example is say that, you get it in the long term. Perhaps helping minorities in the short term doesn't get economic benefits like op does, but in the long term, of course, that unlocks part of the labor force, which has economic benefits, etc., etc. Or perhaps you can achieve economic benefits through a different way, but it's a lot more sustainable, right? You don't get bigger economic benefits by, helping minorities immediately in the short term, but it's more sustainable because minorities are a growing part of the population. They're growing in their educational rates, etc. We get the same benefit, maybe not to the same extent, but it's more sustainable. Lots of new extensions to co-op benefits. Secondly, if op has reasonable impacts and they are bigger, right? You might need a new extension that has really big arguments also. This only happens sometimes, right? Like if you truly uh, underestimated the biggest impacts that either team can potentially claim. And so first speaker's impacts are small compared to ops reasonable yet big impact, then yeah, you might just have to run an extension that has equal or bigger impacts than the other side, alongside responses to them, of course. All right, now we're in the last section. Just very quickly, some tips on how to best synergize with whip and reply. So firstly, you should ensure that you and the whip have unique contributions. Lots of people also ask me, who should do the weighing? Should it be me? Should it be the whip? Who should do the responding? Should it be the deputy? Should it be the whip? It could be either of you, which is why the best way to ensure that you have unique contributions in your speeches is to coordinate beforehand. Talk to each other, during downtime, and let the whip know what the broad strokes of your speech are at least. Even if it's informal. First, I'll try to prove this claim. Second, I'll try to win this clash. And thirdly, I'll do weighing on this, right? Just simple as that. It helps to tell the whip that, right? Let them know what material you're going to run. Secondly, let them know what material you will leave out, right? If the whip makes a suggestion for something for you to run a deputy, you should tell them that if you're not going to use it and why, right? Because if you're not going to use it, there should be a good reason. And if it's lower priority, maybe the whip should take it instead. And so, the whip has sufficient time to prepare that they have to be the ones to say it. If you're not going to say it, don't blindside your whip. But more importantly, if you choose not to run something because you think it's not useful, maybe it's risky to run it and it might have contradictions with your side, maybe it takes too much time to run, you should also tell your whip that concern as well. Because if the whip ends up wasting time on it, then you'll still lose the debate anyway, which is why you should communicate very well on what you think is worth running and what isn't. Now, how can you divide material with whip? Here are a few options, and choose what's most suited to each specific round and also what your styles as speakers are. Number one, the deputy could run a lot of material, both responses and constructives, and then win certain clashes. Then the whip is the one who does the framing and the weighing, new analysis, which makes your arguments more relevant and more engaging with the other side without building a new argument. And then, of course, extraneous responses or lower priority mitigation to other clashes. Second way that you can divide material is the deputy is a very focused speech. It's one frame. It makes sure it establishes one frame. It fulfills that frame. It wins the stakeholder that frame is making important, and does whatever constructive is necessary for that. Then the whip handles almost all responses and extraneous impacting, etc. The third way you can do it is if the deputy is a bit more charitable, right? So this is the incrementalist approach on the material that your team runs. So your deputy does a little more of everything. They're a bit more charitable. They run a bit more arguments, run a bit more responses, responding to the median case. And then your whip is even more, a little bit of everything, a lot of everything, right? The whip is the most responsible. The whip is the most charitable. They respond to all of the worst cases of your side. They do all of the worst case weighing, etc. Third one is the hardest to do, I think. But it's common in Australs, etc., to just have one strategy which you kind of develop incrementally, and speakers do a little bit of everything. So it's also valid even in Asians. So that's the first tip, okay? Ensure that you and the whip have unique contributions, maximize your time accordingly. Second tip, balance out how charitable you are across speakers, right? You don't want to be called out by the judge as the team that is completely unengaging, very uncharitable, assuming the worst case of the other side. And sometimes judges will see it like that, even though you're not so, you are engaging, but all your speakers are punitive, right? It's always assuming, oh, they didn't build this argument. They didn't prove it's true, blah, 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 blah. Of course, there's a place for punitive material, but I think it should be balanced with charitable material, okay? So one option is if your deputy is charitable, right? You're engaging on the worst case of deputy, perhaps it should be the whip that does the nitty-gritty responses that are punitive, prove their arguments are not true, what they didn't build enough. And then your reply can be more charitable or do a mix of both, as is strategic. You can also invert it, right? The deputy could be more punitive, defending the first speaker, destroying what they can from the other team's first two speakers. And then it's the whip that is more charitable. As I've said earlier, the whip that responds to all the worst cases, assumes the best case of the opposite side and responds to it regardless. And then the reply is punitive, right? But not punitive in the same way the deputy is, right? You don't just restate everything. You do more, call outs of what the other team failed to do. But yeah, it's a punitive reply in general. Remember, of course, that you shouldn't just always be charitable, because if you're too charitable, on the other hand, you might be engaging with the other side, but your impacts might look weak, or you might even contradict your best case if you respond so much in your worst case, or at least the judge will think, oh, you're making a concession, right? Since you're talking about your worst case. No, you should balance out being charitable and punitive and be very explicit when you're being charitable, when a certain argument is an even if argument, so that um, yeah, uh, the judge that doesn't just credit the other team and assume that you're making concessions. Last tip I have is that ensure that the reply is distinct from the whip. Lots of people don't know the difference between a whip speech and the reply speech as well. Remember that the whip should be the one making completely new responses, right? Reasons why an argument is not true, rebuttals to an argument. An argument is not true because of my response that I'm giving. Okay. Meanwhile, the reply also says team's arguments are not true, but through meta-analysis, right? Really scrutinizing the way that they said it, right? Firstly, explain how the arguments collapse under their own logic. So for example, as a reply, you can be like, let's assume that their argument is true. Even if you follow their logic, somehow, it doesn't make sense, right? So like assuming they want to help minorities and they do this policy for minorities, it doesn't make sense because they don't explain, etc., right? It collapses under its own logic, not because of the logic of your new response. Okay. Now, another way to do this is explaining how op claims don't pass judge standards, or what an average reasonable person needs to hear to believe an argument. Okay. Of course, it gets obnoxious when teams throw the judge manual around, but if there's actually a basis, right? If a certain judging standard really isn't fulfilled, and it's very hard for the average reasonable person to believe why a certain argument is important or how a certain argument works, you should flag that also in your reply. And lastly, you can talk about burdens, right? Go back to the start of the debate, what the teams seek out to prove, what does the motion require each team to prove to win, right? Explain how the other team did not fulfill their burdens, but of course, make sure to explain why your team fulfilled your burden as well. Okay, so that's how the reply can do it, right? Whereas your whip is creating new weighing, new impacting as to why arguments are important. Reply should do it such that, you're explaining, just re-explaining how the logic of your argument was sound. You're re-explaining why your argument passes basic judge standards, and you're re-explaining how you have accomplished the burden that your first speaker set out from the very beginning. Okay, so that's all I have in terms of case evolution. I hope that sheds a bit of light on it. Of course, a lot of what I've said is easier said than done. So best of luck practicing having better deputy speeches, whip speeches, and replies. I hope you get to practice this at UADC and that everyone has a great tournament. Thank you.